Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Writers Workshop. My name is Salim. I will be serving as your host tonight and will help navigate questions. Our topic tonight is crafting dynamic dialogue with local editor and author Ekta Garg. Before I introduce Ekta, I do want to give a few updates about the library. So we are open back to our regular hours. However, if you don't feel comfortable coming in just yet, that's okay. We are continuing our curbside delivery service. This is where you can request items at home and pick them up in front of the library. For more information on that, you can visit champaign.org/curbside. If you have questions for staff, there are a few ways you can reach out to us. You can book a librarian at champaign.org/book-a-librarian. You can chat with us anytime the library is open, and you can email us at librarian@champaign.org. I also want to share that the short story contest is open and accepting submissions. I will include the link here in the chat where you can find story guidelines and prize information, and that's champaign.org/short-story. And then the form will remain open from now until Friday, November 5th. Friday, November 5th at 6 o'clock. Right. And lastly, I'd like to share a few instructions for communicating through Zoom. So depending on your device, at the bottom of the screen, towards the center, you should see the option to chat. This is where you can type your question in. Next to that is the raise hand option if you want to use your microphone, and I can unmute you. Ekta will answer questions at the end of her presentation, so just pop them in the chat or raise your hand. All right, with that said, I'd like to now introduce our instructor. Ekta's career in publishing began in 2005, and since then, she has written and edited about everything from healthcare to home improvement to Hindi films. She also hosts Biblio Breakdown, which is a podcast where she examines books to offer writing exercises. You can find her original fiction, book reviews, and parenting adventures in her blog, The Right Edge. Her novella, The Truth About Elves, releases October 19th from Atmosphere Press. Ekta, thank you so much for being here. I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Salim. I really appreciate that. I am going to share my screen so you can all see my slides. Can you see that?
Yes, I can.
Let me start this. I'm losing buttons. It's not good. All right, here we go. Once again, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to tonight's webinar on how to craft dynamic dialogue. I hope that by the end of the presentation tonight, you'll have a better idea of how to make the conversations in your stories sparkle and engage readers. When my kids were little and I would put them on the phone with relatives, I would always get a kick out of listening to how the conversations went. There's one response that both of my kids would give to people on the phone that still sticks out to me. In thinking about tonight's topic, I kept circling back to this memory and what it means for how we interact with one another through our real life dialogue. The conversation would usually go something like this. Someone, like my sister, would ask one of my daughters, "What are you doing?" Usually when we ask each other that question, we're thinking in broad terms. Adults say something like, "Oh, I just got back from Target," or "I have a big deadline at work, so I spent all morning on a presentation." Kids, though, are incredibly literal. They live in the here and now, and their world is tied to all concrete things. If, for example, my daughter was standing in the kitchen when she was on the phone with my sister, and my sister asked, "What are you doing?" my daughter would say, "Standing." This would always get a laugh. But I think it's also instructive of what dialogue in our writing should and shouldn't be. When my kids said this on the phone, the person on the other end would laugh, like I said, and then there would be an awkward pause. How do you respond to that after all? How do you carry on a conversation when the person has answered your question in such a specific way? Dialogue should be open-ended enough that we can use it to redirect a scene to build on our story. It shouldn't give up everything right away. There should always be room for more dialogue and more possibilities of where the dialogue can take readers. In other words, dialogue is not just dialogue. It actually does so much more. Tonight, I'd like to spend some time talking about what dialogue can do and how it can function in our stories, how it's not just about the words that people say to one another, how it can really make or break your scenes and stories overall. After that, I'd like to give you some tips on how to accomplish all of this. So let's get started. Dialogue does more than just act as an exchange of information between people. It's also a device you can use to do many things that maybe your narration can't do at all, or that it can't do as effectively. Let's look at some ways that dialogue can be more than just two people talking to one another. The first is that it can convey information about the setting. The Wheel of Time is Robert Jordan's sweeping epic fantasy series with 5 main characters who discover that they have abilities and powers beyond what they knew. Many readers have talked about how much they adore Jordan's incredibly detailed world building, whether this was in the outfits the characters wore, the descriptions of battles, or the complicated magic system that rules the Wheel of Time universe. In the first book of the series, called The Eye of the World, a woman named Moiraine visits the village of Eamon's Field. She tries to hide the fact that she can wield magic because Eamon's Field is practically at the edge of nowhere, and its residents are suspicious of outsiders. When evil forces attack the village, though, Moiraine has no choice but to reveal her magic as she tries to defend the villagers and herself. Later, after the attack, when people start to call for her to be thrown out of the village, Moiraine raises her voice so she can be heard over the crowd. She says, "To the south lies the river you call the White River, but far to the east of here, men still call it by its rightful name, Menetherendrel, the old tongue, waters of the mountain home, sparkling waters that once coursed through a land of bravery and beauty. 2,000 years ago, Menetherendrel flowed by the walls of a mountain city so lovely to behold that stonemasons came to stare in wonder. Farms and villages covered this region, and that you call the Forest of Shadows as well and beyond. But all of those folk thought of themselves as the people of the mountain home, people of Menethrin." She goes on and tells about the king and queen who ruled the land and the sacrifices they made to keep it whole. But this opening to her speech sets the scene for us. It tells us about the land and where the villagers live. If we boil it down to its most basic facts, the information she's given us and the Eamon Fielders is really window dressing, telling us about a river and some mountains. The context and her tone give her dialogue its importance, though. Not only has Moiraine given people time to settle down from yelling for her to get kicked out of town, she's also given them a piece of their history, something that most of them didn't even know. They're farmers, after all. They're mostly worried about tending their flocks and their land and protecting themselves and one another. But in this speech, by giving the people of Eamon's Field a visual picture of what their land used to look like, Moiraine bestows on the villagers a sense of pride about their home. Her speech also helps readers understand that this story really started a long time before the book, which makes it even richer. Jordan was a master at description, so even if he had given this information in the narration, we probably would have appreciated it anyway. But the dramatic impact of the moment is heightened when we hear the start of the story from Moiraine herself. Her dialogue keeps us glued to the chair because she's setting up something even bigger. The next is building characters. One of my most favorite movies of all time is Legally Blonde. I could probably spend a whole evening talking about why I love it so much, but one thing that stands out to me about it is the dialogue. Reese Witherspoon plays main character Elle Woods, a breezy blonde from California in her last year of college. Everything in the first few minutes of the film sets up a scenario where we think we're going to see the stereotypical airhead, but Elle is much smarter than people take her for. She proves this time and again through the dialogue, and the writers did a fantastic job of creating dialogue that outlines who the other characters are too. When the movie starts, we meet Elle as she's getting ready for the big date with her serious boyfriend, Warner Huntington III. All of Elle's sorority sisters are convinced that Warner is going to propose. Elle thinks it'll happen too, which is why she's devastated when he dumps her instead. Warner reminds Elle that he comes from a family of 5 generations of senators, and he's headed to Harvard Law School. California's been fun and all, and hanging out with Elle has been great, but as he says to her, if I'm going to be a senator, I need to marry a Jackie, not a Marilyn. In that line, we know how Warner sees Elle, as a distraction or an amusement. He doesn't see her as someone who could make a meaningful contribution to his life. Like so many others, he's taken her at face value and ignored the rest of who she is. We get sharp insight into his character. Warner leaves Elle to go back to the East Coast. She decides she's going to win him back by going to Harvard Law School herself. So she applies and makes the cut, and on the first day before their first class, she spots Warner. She accidentally bumps into him, and Warner asks, "I'm sorry, are you here to see me?" "No, silly," Elle says, trying to be all cool and casual. "I go here." Warner doesn't believe her, so he asks, "You got into Harvard Law?" And Elle replies, "What, like it's hard?" I love so many things about that line. How naive Elle is about how difficult entrance into Harvard can actually be. The fact that, for the moment anyway, she's ignoring what Warner is really saying or just doesn't get it, that he never thought she'd have the chops to apply to Harvard, forget about getting in. The nuance is subtle here, and for a second, we're wondering too, is Elle actually an airheaded blonde, or is she using this moment to point out to Warner that he was wrong to question her? It's also a moment that highlights who Elle is as a person. Yes, Warner saying he wanted to break up with her was a setback, but she's an optimist. She believes the hardest part, getting into Harvard, is actually done. In Elle's mind, excuse me, she and Warner are meant to be together. Of course she got in. Now he'll see how serious she is, and his family will see she's the right kind of girl for him, and they can get married after all. The dialogue and the rest of the movie does an equally good job of reinforcing Elle's sunny disposition. Even when she hits a roadblock and doubts herself, when she gets past it, she's right back to believing she can pull pretty much anything off. The writers also showcase many times how Warner really only cares about himself. He's got that goal in mind after all, 5 generations of senators, and he's not going to let an old girlfriend or even a new one stand in his way. At key points in the movie, when he talks to Elle, the dialogue between them peels back more and more layers of Warner's true nature. If there was a voiceover or another character talking straight to the camera telling us who Elle was, the impact of the scenes would decrease dramatically. Through her conversations with everyone around her, especially the people who don't believe in her in the beginning, Elle's personality comes to life. Next is advancing the plot. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis is one of the most beloved children's books of all time. For decades, kids and adults alike have read and reread the story of the 4 Pevensey siblings and their adventures in a secret land of magic that they find in an old house. What starts as a trip of exploration turns into a rescue as one of the siblings, Edmund, gets tricked and then captured by the evil White Witch. The witch separates Edmund from his brother and sisters and plans to use him in her plot to secure her place as the ruler of Narnia forever. She's made it winter for the 100 years she's ruled. Always winter, but never Christmas, we're told. But now word is spreading that Aslan, the creator of Narnia, is back after a hiatus. The White Witch isn't going to let Aslan or some stupid human kids stand in her way of continuing her reign. The Pevenseys and Aslan create some complications in that plan, though. At one point, Peter, Susan, and Lucy, the 3 remaining Pevensey kids, are traveling with Mr. and Mrs. Beaver to meet with Aslan. They hear what they think is the sled of the White Witch and hide, all except for Mr. Beaver, who sneaks out to investigate. Within minutes, everyone hears Mr. Beaver calling out to them. "Come and see," he says. "This is a nasty knock for the witch. It looks as if her power is already crumbling." "What do you mean, Mr. Beaver?" Peter asks as he and the others come out of their hiding spot. "Didn't I tell you that she had made it always winter and never Christmas? Didn't I tell you? Well, just come and see." We know by Mr. Beaver's dialogue that something significant is about to happen. But at this point in the book, we're still worried about Edmund. There's also the lurking threat of the witch because Peter, Susan, Lucy, and the Beavers have no idea where she is. They've seen evidence of her treachery, and they don't want to be her next victims. But here, Mr. Beaver's words move the story in a different direction. We realize that maybe, just maybe, something is about to change. And after a paragraph of description, C.S. Lewis tells us what that change is. Santa, or Father Christmas, as they call him in England, is sitting on his sleigh in front of them. I've come at last, he says. She's kept me out for a long time, but I have got in at last. Aslan is on the move. The witch's magic is weakening. The story has now shifted from scary to hopeful. Readers get the signal that even though everything is still kind of a mess, if Father Christmas can get in after 100 years of winter, then things will be all right in the end. When he states outright that the witch's magic is weakening, that confirms it and sets us up for the last part of the book where we see the Pevensies, Aslan, and the good creatures of Narnia rescue Edmund and defeat the White Witch. Even though this is technically a children's book and C.S. Lewis spends a little more time on narrating the story in straightforward terms, he still uses the dialogue in powerful ways to let the characters and the readers know what's coming next. Being told by the omniscient narrator that the characters finally get to celebrate Christmas is one thing. Hearing the wonder and excitement in the characters' voices as they talk about it heightens that excitement and hope. The next is amplifying conflict. In Trust Me, the newest thriller from author Tim Logan, main character Ellen boards a commuter train after a difficult doctor's appointment. She notices a young woman with a baby on the train, and Ellen strikes up a conversation with the mother. The woman introduces herself as Catherine and the baby as Mia. Ellen is taken in by the child. She's coming back from her latest round of tests that confirm she'll most likely never have children of her own, and it's something she's wanted for a long time. Catherine receives a phone call that seems to upset her. As the train pulls close to a stop, Catherine asks Ellen if she'll hold baby Mia for a few minutes. Ellen is all too happy to agree, and she takes Mia in her arms. The next thing she knows, she sees Catherine get off the train and leave the platform. Ellen is stunned, and that feeling quickly morphs into horrified. What did Catherine just do? And what is Ellen supposed to do now? She notices that Catherine left behind a bag full of supplies for Mia, and there's also a note that reads, "Please protect Mia. Don't trust the police. Don't trust anyone." Ellen gets off the train with Mia in tow, but when she reaches the street, she's cornered by a man who kidnaps her and Mia. He holds her hostage for several hours. Finally, with some fast talking and some self-defense, Ellen manages barely to get out of there safely with the baby. No matter what the note said, Ellen has to go to the police now. The man who took her said he wouldn't hurt her, and he was gentle with Mia in a way that shocked Ellen, but he does strike Ellen across the forehead, so now she has a cut. Now that she's away from the nightmare situation, Ellen is sitting in the police station wanting to know the police will keep her safe. She gives Mia to a child protective services agent and goes into another room with two officers, thinking she'll give her testimony about the bizarre incident and be on her way. Instead, the officers are looking at her sideways. In fact, one of them is almost flat out accusing her of taking the baby and making up a story about the abductor. "I don't like the sound of what you're saying," Ellen says. The cop describes how he thinks Ellen must have felt when she held Mia. The urge to have that baby, he says, to hold her, maybe even keep her, to be a better mother to her than anyone else could be. Ellen squirms a little. What the cop is saying hits a little too close to home, but there are lines that Ellen would never cross. "That is an incredibly offensive suggestion, detective," she says. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "I know what it's like to want something you can't have." Ellen looks at the nice cut of his clothes, the slightly arrogant manner with which he's talking to her, and she says, "I seriously doubt that." "We're just trying to dig out the truth, Ellen." "I told you the truth. I was asked to look after her," she says, referring to Mia. "What happened to Catherine?" "I thought that was what you were trying to find." Because Catherine has disappeared into thin air. By this point, it's been 12 hours since she handed Mia to Ellen, and she hasn't come forward to claim the baby. Ellen is scared and confused, but more than anything, she's exhausted and she just wants to go home where she can take a shower and go to bed. Here she was, being the upstanding citizen and bringing Mia to the police, and they're trying to figure out if she has some ulterior motive. At one point, they even accuse Ellen of some bizarre kidnapping plot in which she and Catherine are working together. Tim Logan wrote this book in first person, so we know outright that Ellen is telling the truth. She'd never met Catherine before they saw one another on the train, and she has no idea what's happening. The suggestion from the police officer is upsetting and just makes the entire situation worse. In other words, it increases the conflict. We find out later that Ellen has enough experience with law enforcement to know that this situation is nowhere near over. In fact, it's probably just beginning. Our stories thrive on conflict, and letting characters take verbal jabs at one another is much more interesting and really efficient than trying to describe the fact that two people disagree on something. Conflict, like fireworks, draw our attention right away to the story, and the more we can reinforce it with strong dialogue, the better our stories will be. Finally, dialogue can build backstory. Often we see the narration doing the heavy lifting of backstory, but a lot of times using dialogue is actually more efficient when we want to share information that affects the characters. In All the Ever Afters by Danielle Teller, we get the life story of Agnes, Cinderella's stepmother. Danielle Teller takes her time to build a thoughtful narrative. Of course, with Agnes as the main character, she's bound to be portrayed in a sympathetic light, but the author doesn't make it easy for her. Agnes is part of a family that's hovering around the poverty line. Add to that the fact that she's a girl and she's starting her life already at a disadvantage. When she's a child, her parents let her go work at a local manor house, first so she can be self-sufficient and also so that she's out of their hair. Later in the book, Agnes moves to a convent to continue her education. At the convent, she's expected to live as the nuns do, with full devotion to her studies and God. Agnes has never been around boys much, so when Fernan, one of the messengers for the church, begins showering her with attention, she gets swept up into what she believes is the greatest romance of all time. All of her illusions are shattered when she gets pregnant, and the convent is left to figure out what to do with her. Fernan would just as soon forget that Agnes ever existed, but the mother abbess forces him to take responsibility for his actions. Mother Elphida is displeased, as you might imagine, Fernan says. I am aware, Agnes says, of Abbess Elphida's displeasure. He has threatened to end her patronage of me if I do not take responsibility for the baby, Fernan tells her. Agnes tries to figure out what Fernan means, and after a minute or two, she asks, you have to marry me? I have to take you away from here, Fernan replies. And leave me? No. The last girl, Lizzie, they found her a husband. Mother Elphida refuses to do it again. Agnes is crushed and disgusted. She understands that Fernan may not want to be tied down, but learning this bit of his past makes her see him in a new light. We don't need a long, drawn-out explanation of how Fernan has done this with other girls staying at the convent. In just a few lines of dialogue, we get all the backstory we need. Fernan is a player, a ladies' man, a Casanova. He's done this before, probably many times, and there's nothing to suggest that he plans to stop once he deals with Agnes. Not only do we find out what kind of person Fernan is, because dialogue helps us round out our characters, but also we don't need paragraph after paragraph of how Fernan deceived other girls, got them pregnant, and left them behind. As the author, Danielle Teller doesn't have to give us the entire history of all of Fernan's romantic conquests. And really, this information is much more devastating for Agnes and has a bigger dramatic impact when we hear it in a few words straight from Fernan himself. It tells her all she really needs to know about how Fernan lived his life before she came into the picture. We've talked about how dialogue can function in different capacities in our writing, but how do we actually do what we're talking about here? How do we accomplish writing dialogue that zips along and pulls our scenes together? I've given you 5 ways dialogue functions as more than just a conversation. Let's look at 5 tips for revising or full out editing your dialogue to make it really shine. These are questions to ask yourself and your story when you're jumping into the revision phase. Things to consider as you move from scene to scene. The first thing to consider when you're revising any dialogue in a scene is to ask, who's talking? What characters are in this scene? This might seem like an obvious thing to say, but the character's importance is going to determine what they talk about and also how much space and time on the page you give them. If you write a restaurant scene where a server only shows up once in the entire story, chances are that server may not even need dialogue. If you decide to give the server dialogue, it can be short. We've all been in a restaurant and understand what that situation is like. We don't need the server to go into a long, drawn-out explanation of how ordering a meal works. If, however, you're working on a scene between your protagonist and their faithful sidekick, or maybe even the protagonist and the antagonist, then that dialogue is going to need some extra time and attention. You'll have to examine it more closely, and you'll have to give it more time and care. In other words, don't spend a lot of time trying to create dialogue for tertiary characters who show up once or twice. When you get to the secondary characters, pay attention to them. If it's the primary characters, especially your protagonist and antagonist, stay on high alert for what you need to do to make the dialogue shine. Earlier, I mentioned the Wheel of Time and the dialogue in the scene where Moiraine, the mysterious visitor to Iman's Field, makes a speech to villagers about the history of their land. In this scene, she's the main person talking, of course. A few of the villagers pipe up early on to share their views on her being in Iman's Field, but in this scene, Moiraine is the star. We don't need to hear from those villagers after their first few complaints, and Robert Jordan knew that when he was constructing this. He lets Moiraine do all the talking. In addition to giving the villagers a little bit of their history, she also accomplishes something equally important. She distracts everyone from all the questions they have about why she came to the village. The dialogue here has more than one purpose. It describes the setting, like we talked about, but it also throws a minor red herring into the mix. While the Iman Fielders get their history lesson, most of them are in so much awe about what they've learned that they forget what they were protesting in the first place. It leaves Moiraine free to move on to the next part of her plan, which changes the lives of the 5 main characters of the series forever. Had someone else been doing the talking, the impact wouldn't have been the same, and we wouldn't have understood the importance of Moraine's visit and later her disappearance from Iman's Field. When you work on dialogue between 2 characters, you need to think about what you're trying to accomplish with that dialogue. Why are these 2 characters talking about this topic at this time? What is the purpose of the conversation in this moment? We talked earlier about the different functions that dialogue can have. It can provide backstory or amplify your conflict. It can build the setting of your story or further your plot or reveal something about your character. When you look at your dialogue, ask whether it's accomplishing one of these things or is advancing your story in some concrete way. If it's not, then you need to fine-tune it or even consider getting rid of it completely. In the dialogue I mentioned from Legally Blonde, Elle has a clear agenda when she pretends to bump into her ex-boyfriend Warner on the first day of law school. She wants to surprise him, of course. Maybe in her heart of hearts, she knew that he never took her seriously. This is her chance to prove to him how wrong he was. She also wants to make it a point that Warner isn't the only one doing big, important things with his life, something that Elle struggles with early on and even talks about at one point. Warner wanted to go to Harvard Law School so he can become a senator. Boom, he's at Harvard Law. Elle wanted to go to Harvard Law School to get Warner back. Boom, she's at Harvard Law. Part of her agenda is already done. She thinks that by running into Warner, she's putting the rest of her plan into motion. Her agenda then is to officially start convincing Warner to come back to her. Sometimes we write conversations that are connected to great action or convey romance. We spend ages on these scenes and pour our hearts into them. But before you fine-tune the writing at this level, you need to ask whether the dialogue is even necessary to begin with. Do these characters really need to have this discussion or confrontation or whisper these sweet nothings at this moment? How does this dialogue in this spot contribute to the overall story? How does it further the plot? Here's another way to look at it. Ask yourself, if I took this dialogue out of this spot right now, would it change the story in any way? Would it make my piece confusing to readers? Would they feel like they're missing something? If your answer is yes, then you definitely need to hold on to that dialogue. If the answer is no, you need to ask what the agenda is. Why did you want this conversation in this spot in the first place? Is this something that you could just as easily accomplish with narration? Do you even need it in the story at all? I mentioned The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe earlier, and the scene where Peter, Susan, Lucy, and the Beavers run into Father Christmas. Father Christmas announces that the White Witch's power is weakening. Immediately following his announcement, he gives Peter, Susan, and Lucy presents that actually turn out to be important to the story later. Then he declared that he's going to start visiting everyone else in Narnia because he has a lot of catching up to do. If Father Christmas hadn't said anything about the witch's powers, the target audience for this book, children, might have been a little confused as to why he was allowed into Narnia when the witch prevented him from coming in. It would have felt really strange for him to pop in and say a quick hello to the Pevensies and the Beavers and then just go on his way. More than that, it would have created another problem. Without the dialogue between Father Christmas and the others, we would have assumed that author C.S. Lewis had left a major plot hole in the book. When plot holes like this start showing up, readers aren't able to trust the characters in the story. When that trust is lost, the author loses the readers. With key dialogue telling us why Father Christmas can come in, we have a link to what comes next, especially when it comes to the gifts he gives Peter, Susan, and Lucy. That link takes us to the next part of the story and sets us up for the big showdown in the climax. Without the conversation here, the book would not have made sense. At every point of dialogue, you have to ask, do people talk like this in real life? It's hard sometimes to know whether this is the case. I've read dialogue in manuscripts that often include words or phrases that don't sound true to the characters. The problem with dialogue like this is that it sticks out in a bad way. Our number one goal as writers is to give readers an experience that is so immersive that they can't tell the difference between real life and the story we wrote. If anything trips them up in the reading process, it'll break that spell. Readers will remember that they are, in fact, reading a piece of fiction or something that doesn't relate to their real life. The minute that happens, we leave the door open just a crack for their own doubts and questions to come in. If we trip them up too many times, in other words, if the dialogue doesn't fit the story world and the character profiles we've set up, then readers are more likely to stop reading completely, and we definitely don't want that to happen. This doesn't mean that you have to make all of your characters sound the same. It also doesn't mean that you can't include unusual words or phrases. The key is this: does your language sound relatable within the context of your story world? Do those unusual words or that different way of speaking fit the characters, the time period, and the plot you've laid out for readers to follow? Even if you're writing an epic fantasy series, if your language fits your story world and characters and makes sense within those parameters, then it's definitely relatable. I mentioned Trust Me by Tim Logan earlier. Ellen has survived a harrowing experience of being kidnapped, all because she was helping a stranger on the train. The stranger, a woman, asks for help, and Ellen plays Good Samaritan by holding the woman's baby. Now, more than 12 hours later, she's in the police station defending her actions. What she says to the cops could have come out of the mouth of absolutely anyone. Ellen is tired and confused and even offended. How dare the cops suggest she's concocted some bizarre plot to kidnap Mia? Ellen was the one who was kidnapped. She was the one who needs help. Yes, it's a little weird that Catherine, the woman from the train, hasn't come forward to claim her child, but Ellen knows that in reality, that's not actually her problem. She's done everything right, by the law and by society and her conscience, and yet this cop, standing over her, has the audacity to question her motives. So yes, she's going to get annoyed and frustrated and possibly hold a little something back. Serves the cops right, she thinks, for treating her like she's the suspicious one. I'm willing to bet that most of us have never been in this situation that Tim Logan sets out so masterfully, but we've all been in a place where we set out to do one thing, only to have the recipient of that action or another person completely misunderstand it. We've all found ourselves getting upset that the other person is misinterpreting our words and actions, which means that Ellen's dialogue is completely relatable. Sometimes we want our characters to talk to one another, but the things they discuss don't really need to be in dialogue. Narrative or description can be a more efficient way to convey some concepts. We don't need a character to go on and on. This is especially common in what writing experts call as you know, Bob conversations. It's where characters are essentially giving us an info dump in dialogue form. We don't need them to give us all of this information by talking to us or one another about it. That doesn't mean, of course, that you just go ahead and include that info dump in other places. There are better ways to include the information. An easy way to know what to include at any given time, and whether it's dialogue or narration, is to ask, do my readers absolutely need to know this at this moment in this scene? If the answer is no, don't put the information there. Find another place to put it. In All the Ever Afters by Danielle Teller, main character Agnes is talking to Fernan, the boy who got her pregnant and was now responsible for her. He mentions in an offhanded way that there was another girl in the same position, another girl he got pregnant. The convent where Agnes lives helped the other girl by finding her a husband, but they're fed up with Fernan and are forcing him to deal with the situation himself. That little throwaway comment about the other girl is important because it reaffirms for readers what they already know about Fernan. He's a world-class jerk. It's even more important for Agnes because at this point in the story, she's only just starting to get it. This isn't going to be the start of some old world romance. This is the start of her life possibly getting derailed. And what's even worse is that the boy who helped her drive the train in this direction has done it before with other girls. When their lives went off course, he just jumped and saved his own skin. Agnes needs to know this now, at this point in the story, so that later when Fernan continues to disappoint her, it's not such a big shock anymore. She almost starts to expect it. In fact, it becomes one of the hallmarks of their relationship and one of the factors in her motivation to find solutions to her problems herself. What's not important for us or Agnes to know through the dialogue or even through the narration is what happened to that other girl. We don't need to know where she lives now, her husband's name, if she had the baby or lost it. None of it is important because it doesn't contribute anything to Agnes's story. And really, we don't need Fernan to go on and on about his relationship with that other girl. We don't need paragraphs and paragraphs of him comparing her to Agnes. Just that one little line about how the convent took care of her is enough for us and Agnes to find out the most important part about who Fernan is as a person. Just like anything else in writing, one of the fastest ways to get better at writing dialogue is to keep doing it and practicing it. While it may seem frustrating when you're working on your own story, here are some tips for things you can do to help train your writer's ear and your actual ear for excellent dialogue. The first is to examine conversations and stories and books that you already love. We all have stories and books like this that hit our personal list as the best ones. Go back to them and pick out a couple of longer conversations. Reread them and look at how they function in those stories and books in those moments. What is the dialogue accomplishing? What purpose does it serve in addition to being a conversation between two people? How does it take the story a step ahead? Remember, the best dialogue always does double duty. What other job is the dialogue performing here? One of the easiest ways to learn about dialogue and how to replicate it realistically in your work is to listen to it. Pick a TV show or a movie that you've seen a couple of times. Now turn it on and close your eyes. Listen to how the characters are talking to one another. Where do they pause? Are they stressing specific words? What things are they leaving out? Based on what you hear, what do you think they mean when they don't mention something important? The more you can train your ear to listen for realistic dialogue, the easier it'll be for you to write it. Okay, I'll admit it. I am one of those writers who loves eavesdropping. It's always amazing to me the kinds of conversations people will have in public, especially when they're so preoccupied with what they're saying or who they're talking to that they forget that there are other people around. This was easier to do before the pandemic when we spent way more time out and about, but now that things are getting back to normal again, give it a try. However, I'm not saying to be super creepy, and please don't make it obvious that you're listening in, but do try to catch some of what another person is saying when they're on the phone or talking to someone else. Listen to the exchanges, the way they address one another, and what happens if the conversation gets a little tense. Think about how to replicate the same things in your own work and how you might fit the conversation to a situation with your characters, or how you might change things to take the story in another direction. A really convenient place to start with how to write realistic dialogue is with your own conversation. Think about how you spoke to your significant other or child about something funny or strange or sad. Try to write it out. When you're in the moment, consider what you're saying with your words and with what you're not answering. For example, take the question, how was your day? Sometimes when someone asks us that question, we'll say something like fine or awful or normal, but sometimes we'll jump right into the middle of everything, like saying, oh, I was on my way to work and I got a flat tire and it made me so mad because I told my husband to let me drive the other car, but he just sped right out the door before he could hear me. I was late and I had to do that presentation this morning, the one I was telling you about last time, and my boss loved it. And later she came and said I was getting a bonus. And then I went to that little sandwich place, but they said they were out of my favorite sandwiches. I was so hungry by this point that I ended up just going through the drive-thru for a burger. And it wasn't that bad, but I know it's going to make my cholesterol shoot through the roof. And on and on and on. This little story has a lot of information, but not once did the original question, which was, how was your day, actually get answered in a straightforward way. And once you start paying attention, you'll realize that we actually talk like this a lot in real life. Our dialogue takes us all over the place, and we answer questions that weren't even asked or intended. The trick is to use this in a way that takes your story further. We've all read stories where one character comes in and says to another, can we talk? Depending on the context and what the relationship is between the two characters, many times this conversation goes sideways. In fact, if you're doing your job as the writer, it should go a little bit sideways so that you can hike up the tension and maybe even deepen the conflict. Dialogue has the luxury of being as short as you want it to be. We can use sentence fragments. We can intentionally misdirect the reader by misdirecting other characters. It also gets grace in that it doesn't always have to hit on what a character wants to know or needs to understand in order to move forward in the story. In fact, sometimes, and in some genres, misdirection is exactly what you need. If you're a writer who still doesn't fully feel confident in their dialogue, then say it out loud. Pick a scene and give the dialogue the kinds of inflections and emphasis you want or that you hear in your head when you wrote it. See how it sounds to your ear. A lot of times dialogue on the page will land differently than when it's spoken aloud. This doesn't mean that you replicate word for word what you say or what you hear. We don't need all the boring bits that we all tend to talk about. That story that I just shared about the flat tire and the bonus, that probably wouldn't work as dialogue because it's chock full of information that isn't that compelling. I mean, who cares whether the sandwich place was out of the speaker's favorite sandwiches? And if she's mad at her husband, okay, fine. But was it a solid raging anger, or was it the sort of little bickering kind of annoyance we all feel toward our significant others from time to time? My guess is it would be the second one. And if that's the case, then that information isn't really all that interesting either. When we go to our dialogue and ask, what's the agenda here? Automatically, our dialogue will have a sense of purpose. When it gets that sense of purpose, then all of these other things start to fall in line. As you can see, dialogue isn't just people talking. It's a tool in your writing that you use to make your story better and bring your readers closer. With a little practice and time and attention, your characters will start talking about all the important things every single time, no matter how big or small the topic, and your writing will be that much stronger. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time and attention this evening. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you ever want to discuss your writing project. One of my deepest joys is helping writers and giving back to the writing community. So if you ever have questions about anything writing related, or if you want to brainstorm an idea, I'm always happy to spend time doing so. So please do get in touch, and thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Ekta. So we have plenty of time for questions if you want to pop them in the chat or raise your hand. Now there's a question in the chat and they are asking, is it okay to use dialect in a character's dialogue?
I think it's okay to use a little bit. The trouble with using a lot of dialect is that it becomes hard to read after a certain point. And what will happen is it'll actually slow down the reader because they'll be trying to figure out exactly what the person is saying and then sort of almost translating that in their minds. So it would actually be better to start off with just a little bit of dialect and add some description, like if a lot of times this really applies to characters who are Southern. So say something, like their voice drawled as slow as molasses or something to that effect. And then readers will kind of bring their own idea of what a Southern accent means to their minds. And then they'll be able to use their own imaginations of what that sounds like. I think sometimes writers, we feel like we have to provide all of the information to our readers, and readers actually love using their own imaginations. They like sort of filling in the blanks for themselves. So don't be afraid to trust them a little bit and don't go so heavy on the dialect. Maybe use just a little bit or sprinkle it out throughout the story. Any other questions?
While we are waiting to see if more questions come through, I just want to share one reminder. So the next workshop will be on Wednesday, October 20th at 7 p.m. with the workshop Finishing Your Story. And this will be with local writer and teacher Chris Vanjanek. So make sure to sign up for that one if you haven't already. Give it a few more seconds for questions. Yes, please. We have plenty of time for questions if you have some. I know the chat feature can take a few minutes to figure out sometimes.
Yeah. You're always welcome to raise your hand.
They just shared, thank you so much for all the great tips on dialogue.
Welcome.
Oh, and a new question, how do you know when to stop dialogue?
I think I would need a little bit more context to be able to answer that in the best way. But I would, just off the top of my head, I would say just before any major reveals. You don't want to give away too much. You definitely want your readers to be asking what's going to happen next. And if you give away everything in a single conversation, then the readers have no reason to keep going. And if you think about it, TV shows do a really good job of this, like murder mysteries do a really good job of this in terms of books, where you'll be reading and you'll get to the end of one chapter and it's you're following one character to the end of the chapter and there's a cliffhanger and there's a really important conversation that's happening. And then you start the next chapter or you go to the next scene after the commercial break and they've moved on to something else. And you now are super invested in what happened. What was that other character going to say? What information were they going to share? What was going to happen next? And you stay engaged with the TV show or the movie or the book because you want to know what happened. So I would say stop it just before the big reveal and make sure you hang on to that information to come later. But if you have a specific question about a story or context, I'm more than happy to discuss that more over email. Don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay, well, I don't see any hands raised or questions coming through the chat. But I want to say thank you to Ekta. A lot of good information. Thank you so much.
Yes, absolutely. My pleasure. And I will, as I do every time, I will post this, a concise version of this to my blog, and I'll send that link to Solemn when it goes live so that you all can come back and get the highlights of it. I know the recording, yeah, no, of course, I know the recording goes on the library's YouTube page, but if you ever just want a really quick, easy reference point and you don't necessarily want to sit and listen to the whole thing, then you can always come to the blog and then go back and watch the full recording later.
Thank you. And thank you for providing that. That's very helpful.
Of course, my pleasure.
Well, thank you for attending, everyone. We hope you enjoyed tonight's webinar, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.